there needs to be a fundamental rethink of how we are preparing young people for the transition into the world of work. We don't even know the jobs that young people are going to do when they graduate or leave school or whatever. It feels like these transferable human skills and tools, if we gave those to young people, it would allow them to grow in confidence, to have a certain future-proofing in them, but I think particularly allow them to navigate these transitions.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Jim Carrick-Birtwell runs one of the most interesting talent conferences in Europe. Jim believes that any complex problem is best solved when we look at it from a lot of different angles, and the more diverse the perspectives, the better. So he's been bringing everything from playwrights and poets to philosophers and politicians together and asking them, what are the technical skills? What are the soft skills? What are the mindsets, the ethics, the behaviors that leaders need to navigate the future of work? As the co-founder and CEO of Future Talent Learning and Change Board, Jim has developed learning programs for employers worldwide on how to grow purpose-driven organizations. And he's confident that businesses can reach new heights by focusing on diversity within the workplace, skill development, and personal self-awareness. In this episode, we talk about the lack of preparation many young adults face after graduating, and the need for more transferable skills within the workforce in general. We talk about creating spaces that cultivate ideas and emotional development and how we can measure our own soft skill improvement. Things like team communication, problem solving, presentation skills. We discuss how to optimize a workplace for different groups of people, focusing on the kinds of leadership that bring together divergent, even conflicting ideas and opinions. Jim talks about the benefits and the process of becoming a B Corporation, and much more. If you enjoy this episode of Work for Humans, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, without further ado, my conversation with Jim Carrick-Birtwell. Jim Carrick-Birtwell, welcome to Work for Humans.
Dart, pleasure to be here.
I first came across you in the context of your conference. And you lead a conference in London that does something that I just find so compelling. And in fact, I heard about it from somebody in Australia, Gareth Flynn, who said, you need to go to this conference because it's not like anything else. And then the pandemic happened, and I haven't been able to go except virtually. Someday, I hope it happens again. And what you do in that conference, as I look at it, is you bring the humanities to business. And in particular, the humanities to human resources and questions of people. I remember you had one speaker that was a vicar. She was the rector of the St. James Church, Piccadilly. Mm-hmm. You had a philosopher. You had an ethicist. You had a barrister. You had the director of the Royal Theatre come in. Fascinating speaker. You had the deputy leader of the Labour Party. It's this incredibly diverse group of thinkers. So my first question is, what do these thinkers bring that you feel business leaders need to know?
That's a really good question, Dart. We're, as a business, Future Talent Learning, and a brand that we developed some time ago, maybe 15 years ago, was Future Talent. And that partly came out of a personal interest in education to employment, which I know you and I have spoken a lot about. Future Talent is all about an exploration of what are the skills, the mindsets, and the behaviors that we all need to navigate the changing world of work. And that's a subject that we've explored for a really long time. And actually, the conferences are full-day events, and they take a particular theme in a kind of Davos-esque way. So even though our audience tend to be HR leaders, we never frame it as an HR conference. So the subjects might be after Brexit happened or Trump got elected, trust. How do we rebuild trust? It might be humanity and technology. how should we be thinking about those subjects, or skills to thrive in the fourth industrial revolution. The subjects that we come back to consistently are what are the skills we need and inclusion. And given those topics, I think to answer your question, how do we decide on the speakers? It's this kind of clunky term, cognitive diversity, which I have to say, the term itself feels clunky, but I love what it stands for. And it's this idea that if you're dealing with wicked problems or wicked issues or big, ambiguous, unknowable challenges, then the more perspectives you can bring to bear on those particular challenges, the more likely you are to get richer answers. And people can kind of riff off one another. And if you bring people together from different backgrounds, that's going to create a more, not just more entertaining, but more interesting set of outputs. The other thing in terms of why do we bring such an eclectic range of people together, it is this idea of entertainment. And I think entertainment is a really serious subject at the heart of learning. And ultimately, we've evolved and become a learning business, and our conferences and events teed us up in many ways to do that, because they've helped us understand how people learn more efficiently and effectively. There's a lot more I could say about that, but I think bringing people together and taking them on an emotional journey and an entertaining journey where there's light and shade, there's humor. It's a bit like if you were a play, whatever the play, you don't want it to be rib-tickingly funny the whole way through, because that gets a bit dull. You don't want to be earnest or serious or tragic all the way through. So the great plays have a mix of light and shade. They have laughter, tragedy, all within one play, and different characters play that out. And in a conference, we have our speakers play that out.
It's very interesting. By way of analogy, my father was a butterfly collector, and we used to go to the tops of mountains to collect butterflies. And the reason you go to the top of a mountain is because certain species of butterflies all know to fly uphill. Why? Because as long as they all agree to that, they're all going to meet up there, and they want to meet. And so that's called hilltopping. And a conference like yours is like that. And by creating the right kind of mountain, you create a very specific kind of hilltop that attracts a very specific kind of butterfly, which is the kind that is interested in what I would call intellectual entertainment. I mean, it's not the Marvel universe. It's deep thinkers looking at a problem from very diverse directions. Do you feel like you've created a kind of a rarefied community that can meet each other?
Absolutely. And what I'm thrilled about is over the last kind of 15 years, our community has grown because people have invited kindred spirits themselves into the community. I mean, a bit like the way you found your way to us. And that creates a magic of its own, because I think there is a need for that sense of quite organic and natural solidarity. You can't force people to be interested in certain subjects. But actually, if people know, oh, these subjects are being discussed, I'm interested in them, and the style in which they're being explored, it is appealing, and people who I trust have recommended it, then you are going to get that kind of, hopefully, a sufficiently diverse range of people as audience, to your analogy, or butterflies, meeting in those kind of hilltop or theatre venues.
What would you say are some of the most, it's funny because I was going to ask this question, some of the most compelling speakers. And the reason I'm asking that question is because I'm exploring what the business community is hungry for. But I might even modify it to say combinations of speakers, because we can start off with individuals, but then a lot of what you're talking about is not individual speakers. It's about how collections of speakers come together.
Yeah. So if I was saying, what is the single thing that, in my experience, creates engagement, emotional connection between a speaker and an audience, it's vulnerability and honesty. I've kind of learned that myself over time, that actually having a very polished performance and being either very funny or very intellectually coherent, it gets you so far. People, they listen with emotions as much as with their rationality. And so if I give you an example, there's a chap which to a global audience might not be that well known, but there's a guy called Selene Henry, who's a black comedian who is very well known to kind of British audiences, and he's done extremely well. But he's become a Shakespearean actor and ended up playing Othello. He's a campaigner and activist on all sorts of things. So he's become quite a significant public figure. And I wanted to get him into our conference, and really unusually he said, okay, well, we're gonna set up a call, and I hope you don't mind, but I'm gonna invite my writer to it. And I thought, never had that before. So we have a 3-way call. We've got half an hour, and I end up describing what I wanted him to do, which was, the conference was about inclusion, and I wanted him to tell his story as a black man navigating his way through his career and into society and to become a public figure. And I knew there was all sorts of, in the backstory, various challenges along that way. And I said, if you were able to just to tell your kind of almost your autobiographical story, and then the challenges you faced and the perspectives you've had, I think that would be very powerful. And I said, I didn't see your Othello in London, but it got rave reviews. You couldn't get a ticket for it. And if you ended up with your final speech or a speech from Othello, I said, I think that would be absolutely amazing. And then again, completely unusually, 2 days before the event, I got an email from his writer with his script. Never had that. And I read it. It was hilarious, but incredibly moving. And I said to my wife, and he's got Othello. He's put Othello in it. He's going to do Othello. So then the day arrives, and he was hilarious, but it was also painful because he described when his mother first came to London from the Caribbean, and, she was walking to the shops and people would cry out, "Where's your tail?" And they would be all sorts of kind of references. And it was somebody describing as a child what it was like to not really understand what was the abuse that was being hurled at his mother, and so on and so forth, with a whole sequence of things that many people would never ever experience or face or even know about. And he was able to tell that story. And then when he came to do Othello, he described how he never thought Shakespeare was someone from a working class background. And then he met this guy who was a very down to earth Shakespearean actor. Says, "Oh, I'll teach you how to do this, Lenny. Don't worry about it. It's just a couple of blokes having a chat. Pretend they're in the pub. You play one part and I'll play the other." And he said he just demythologized it and he made it accessible. And all of a sudden, I could go to the other side of the looking glass and see the amazing power of what was being said. And of course, when he did his performance, he made it so accessible. And he was doing his speech, and then he told this story about how he got to know Shakespeare and this chap that had helped him. And then he was quiet for about 5 seconds. 5 seconds in a theatre of quietness feels like a very, very long time. And then he started just growling out with this bellowing voice, this final speech from Othello. And honestly, it gives me goosebumps even thinking about it now. But it was so amazingly powerful. And so a combination of the vulnerability that he'd shown, the authenticity, the honesty, the journey, but also it moved people. And I know you and I have talked about to teach, to delight, to move. I did an English degree. I've directed and produced plays, and actually great speeches and great presenters, they can take you on a journey where they can transmit information to teach. Actually, we all like having a bit of a laugh, and we learn better when we're having fun, learning that doesn't feel like learning. So a comedian, great for that. So that's the delight bit. But actually, to move people, and either in a speech on its own, or for me, if I'm curating or producing a whole event, I want the day to not just teach, not just to delight, but I want to move people. And actually, I've learned over the time that the trigger to that is to have that emotional honesty.
What is coming to me from this is it's very easy for business and HR to become technocratic. In fact, I've made a living as a technocrat. One of the things that fascinates me more than almost any other, in fact, it's the most interesting thing for me in the world right now, which is how large systems, which we tend to try to improve as a third-person problem, since you're a writer, it's a third-person problem, which is you stand far away from that system and you look at it and you try to make it optimized in some way. But then there's the first-person experience of that large system. And the first-person experience of that large system is not at all the same thing. It's emotional. And we talk about business in an unemotional way, but then we experience business and living inside business is an incredibly emotional way. And so we get such a huge dose of the technocratic piece that there's an antidote in really looking at the human side. And people respond to that.
They do. And I think the human side of life, of work, is becoming increasingly understood to be central to how we navigate whether we're a technocrat or not. Because I think even the way you've described it, it's helpful if you can have many different problem solvers working together, looking at a technocratic problem. And then how do you form collaboration between and efficiency between many different perspectives or problem solvers? And I've long thought that, for example, in education, an outstanding education anywhere in the world is currently now relatively technocratic still. It's about, can you remember certain knowledge and can you demonstrate that in some shape or form? And actually, I was asking someone recently who, was an inspector in charge of public administration in schools, and they uphold this outstanding mark. And I was saying, well, but how fit for purpose are the pupils coming out of your school with that outstanding to deal with the problems that are going on and the challenges and to navigate relationships and what? And he really didn't have an answer. That's not the agenda. And I was kind of saying, well, what about if we had every pupil, no matter where they were in whatever school, problem solving, real world problem solving was one of the outputs, so that in any scenario in life, you would be confident that you would be able to ask the right questions, think about things in a certain way, and actually be confident that you'd be able to navigate your way through that problem. What an amazing life skill. And how many hours do you think? I mean, there's books like Grit that say 10,000 hours, but say 1,000 hours, say even 100 hours to every young person. But I think also to every adult. They're a product of that education system. The likelihood is they haven't thought about problem solving in an efficient way. And just the ability to ask questions in the right way, to create a safe environment where they can collaborate with people and there's no such thing as a dumb answer. So how do you create psychological safety? That's a human challenge that's very helpful whether you're a technocrat or not. So I think even just taking your example, the human skills are increasingly important to allow a capability to develop for us to navigate the future.
What you're describing, as the picture forms in my head, is, first of all, I want to talk about one of the things I know you care deeply about, which is the challenges of the step from education to employment. And you were just talking about some of that. So I see this large system, which is business or employment. I see this other large system, which is education. They have their own set of norms. They have their own set of, measures. Very easy for education to become technocratic, which I think that might have been a part of what you're describing. And there's a phase shift that people have to go through to move from one to the other, and it's a tough one. Sometimes I think the longer people stay in education, the harder the transition can be because they're more adapted to the norms of the educational institutions. So what are you seeing in terms of that transition from education to employment? How are we doing?
I think appallingly. I think we're at the starting blocks of preparedness, and there isn't a game plan. And I haven't seen that game plan anywhere in the world. So my backstory is I'm kind of first person in my family to go to university, and that ended up being Oxford University, which is where I'm old enough to, back in the day, I was paid by the government to read literature for 3 years. Amazing. And actually, I sort of then trundled off into the world of work with no guidance, support, completely random. And later in my career, I kind of thought, well, surely things have changed, realized they hadn't, and got involved in some government projects in Britain with Prime Minister David Cameron and coalition government, and sort of got to look under the hood of what is going on from education to employment. And actually, my perspective on it is that there needs to be a fundamental rethink of how we are preparing young people for the transition into the world of work. And a lot of that is about, yes, there are certain knowledge that you need to have, but there are a huge number of transferable skills that you need, because we don't know what you're going to do. It's commonly understood now that we don't even know the jobs that young people are going to do when they graduate or leave school or whatever. So it's preparing them so that they are adaptable and agile to deal with whatever they might need to do. And actually, the ability to transition is something worth focusing on. So what I mean by that, we talk about the word transformation and change, and we have a sense of what that means for business and more broadly. But I would say another perspective on transformation is the ability to be good at transitioning. And actually, if you look at that transition from education to employment, if the education system focused on that transition moment and said, look, it's an inevitability, it's going to happen, and it's going to keep recurring throughout your working life, whatever you choose to do, let's optimize for that. So what do you need to be really good at to transition? Well, the starting point is you need a certain self-awareness about how do you respond to change, because we all respond differently to change. And actually, that's okay. So understanding there are loads of different models and different norms about how we respond to change. And it doesn't matter which one you are, and you might prefer to move towards another one, but at least normalize that. And then things like relationships. You're going to need to, whether it's with interviews or whether it's at careers fairs or whether it's talking to parents of people that you've been introduced to, or any kind of social capital you can get your hands on, you need to be able to access that. So let's talk about how to have conversations. Let's break that down into communication skills, but even asking questions. I'll give you an example of that. There are different sorts of conversations that people have. Someone asks a question and someone says no. Someone asks a question and someone says, yes, but, which kind of feels like a no, really. It's not going anywhere. I'm not going to pursue that. Someone asks a question and someone says, yes, and then someone says, oh, yes, and, yes, and. So it's tricks some improvisation, but it takes you onto a journey and an exploration with that other person that the no's and the yes buts never get out the starting blocks. Now, that's a super helpful skill to give young people to navigate through that transition. And it allows them to have confidence that whatever those gatekeepers look like, however fierce, however different from them, they've got something in their toolkit to navigate through that. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but it feels like these transferable human skills and tools, if we gave those to young people, it would allow them to grow in confidence, to have a certain future proofing in them, but I think particularly allow them to navigate these transitions.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's this self-awareness of how you like to change, but also what you just described gives you an awareness of how other people are framing things. So when you talk to your manager and your manager says, yes, but, versus yes, and, you know what's going on. You know that the but was a stopper for you, but it might not be, not really. And so let's figure out if it's a real thing or if it's just a habit.
Yeah. And you can be playful in schools because the great thing kids have is they are instinctively more playful. You can frame it in different ways. You don't have to frame it as this is going to be for a college or a job interview. You can frame this is about how you try and get a date, or how do you talk to somebody that you find attractive. Let's experiment with yes and, because, I remember this. I mean, you work up the courage for the first question and then you have absolutely no idea how it's going to go forward from that. And then you see these other people that can have these conversations with people that they find attractive that just go on and on. And my son's a bit like that. He's got an older sister. He's very comfortable with girls. He's only 13, but he's realized he finds them quite attractive. He's got a queue of friends that are saying, Albie, how do you talk to girls? And he started having a little coaching club in school. I mean, his popularity's gone through the roof. He's at a new school and he's found this outlet, which is how to chat with girls. So if you can put things in a context that is meaningful, applicable, and actually quite fun, and if you had teachers that were able to do that and teach people these life skills, I think that'd be really quite cool.
I want to talk about some of those life skills because I know you have a leadership education program, and we've just talked about two of the things that are in that program, and I want to make sure we touch upon the other ones. One of them is self-awareness, which you were just talking about. Another one is self-regulation. What is that?
I think it can mean lots of different things, but I think, so at one level, it can be, self-regulation can be to do with communication, helping people to communicate and to present with confidence, no matter what the scenario, is a great life skill to have. We've all felt when you are preparing for a podcast like this, or you've got a meeting with a colleague, or you're going to have a chat with a friend, and you physically you're aware something's going on here. My hands feel a bit clammy and my mouth's a bit dry. I'm breathing differently. There's a certain anxiety building. And actually, sometimes we've even been in a scenario where you start a pressurized conversation and you feel like you're having a bit of an out of body, full frontal lobotomy experience. And the idea that that might happen again is really very terrifying. So how do you physiologically self-regulate? And there's lots of the things that actors are taught specifically around that. So things like breathing, not breathing from your upper chest. Actually, that's your fight or flight mechanism. That's where you get adrenaline coursing. So you might have heard, okay, well, I need to practice my breathing before I do this presentation. But if you're doing it from your upper chest, you might as well be just lighting your adrenaline up. So actors breathe from their core. In my case, my Wampax, which is lower down, that's the benefits of podcasts. You can visualize without seeing that. And actually allowing yourself to breathe into a Wampax and really let your tummy out. Actually really very relaxing and breathing in. And that alone can really help self-regulate. There's other self-regulation, which is, say, for example, if you want to have more inclusive conversations, what on earth does that mean? And part of that is recognizing your own status and power and the status and power of other people. So typically, if you're the boss and you're in a meeting, then actually just being aware that this is probably the most important meeting for the other people around that table today, or even a conversation or even an email exchange. That is, for you, you're dealing with this the whole time. But for them, the exchange other people have with you is probably the most significant. So it makes you automatically, just knowing that, be less casual about it. But also in terms of giving other people the confidence to speak up. So if you have more power, more clout, actually maybe speaking last is a good idea, and asking other people and drawing them out first. And again, some of these things are actually not very complicated, but a little bit of knowledge and insight from that training can have a dramatic impact on the quality of conversations, the level of psychological safety, inclusion that you are able to provide as a manager or as a leader. So those are just a couple of examples of, I think, what self-regulation in reality looks like.
Yeah. And so much of the conversation in the business world has been about digitization. And I think a lot of that is because it's easy to sell digitization. In other words, there's an object there that can be sold. What you're talking about is something that I think we could probably talk to somebody in Greece 3,000 years ago, and they'd be able to have the wisdom to know these things, potentially. And that's the sort of thing you're bringing forward.
I think so. I think a lot of these human skills are evergreen. Demosthenes, back in ancient times, taught people how to communicate, got people to stand on a beach, put pebbles in their mouth, and give a speech to the ocean. So a lot of the self-regulation we've just talked about happened in a different way, but trying to achieve the same thing thousands of years ago. That's absolutely right. I think one of the things that human skill development needs to do to make it more akin to digital skill development is to understand what kind of metrics are applicable. Because I think that's one of the things about human skills, soft skills, emotional intelligence, call it what you will. You need to make it tangible for people. So I'm not into measuring for measurement's sake, but if I give you an example of that, we're really into, as a future talent learning business, into marginal gains. And we're into empowering individuals to measure and notice their own marginal gains. So if I give an example, say we're working with somebody and they are practicing giving feedback. So a coach catches up with me and says, "Hi, Jim, I know you were practicing giving feedback in a different way, trying that new technique that we've learned recently. Did you do it? And if you did, how did you get on last week? Out of 10, how would you scale yourself?" And I might say, "Yeah, I did it. But actually, do you know what? It was harder than I thought. It actually wasn't very good. I'd give myself a 4 out of 10. And if they say, "Okay, why was it better than a 3? I find that mildly irritating, if I'm honest, because I'm now having to speak positively about a 4 relative to a 3. But I'll kind of roll with this. So, of course, I know how it could have been worse." So that's what I say. And then if they say, "Okay, what would a 5 look like? And what would a 10 look like?" Well, that's really asking me to shoot for it. But I also would have an idea in my world what a 10 would look like. And if you keep doing that every time you're practicing a particular discipline, what outstanding learning I think looks like is if at the end of a period of time, someone can say, "Jim, I can see you've done a lot on feedback. You've worked hard on that over the last few months. How have you got on?" And if I can say confidently, "Well, I started as a 4 out of 10. That looked like this. I've practiced this technique. I've been to this event. My coach has helped me with this. I'm now a 6 out of 10, and that looks like this. I'm shooting for a 7. That looks like this." That's outstanding learning, because actually you've internalized the learning and you've worked out how to calibrate marginal improvements. And the things about soft skill development, it's all about practice. It's not about, I got the theory of feedback. It's actually only when the rubber hits the road and you can take it with you. And I think it's really inclusive, which is, I think, very important, because it's not giving you a third-party benchmark. It's saying, we believe everybody can make substantial improvements across all of the parameters of soft skill development. But it's really important that you've got somebody who's encouraging you to understand your starting point, saying, "And that's okay. And let's calibrate and let's make marginal improvements." And I think once that starts happening, and if it happened in the education system with this kind of work, and it happened in the workplace more scalably with this kind of work, then I think it would gain a greater currency. Whereas digital has got that kind of tangible, someone knows how to code, someone knows how to fix this, that, or the other. What do you think about that, Dart?
What is interesting about what you're saying is that sometimes I think soft skills are innate. Empathy, for instance, it's a key skill to designing experiences for others. Absolutely key skill. And a lot of this show is about the design of work experience. And so I'm always looking at this question of how do we create more empathy in a workplace to help with that? Can empathy be taught?
I think it can, and if I explain why. So actually, you made the point earlier about some people are just instinctively better at human skills. I think that can also be a pitfall because you then carry on with things that you think, okay, well, I know I'm confident with people, so I'll carry on interacting with people in a certain way. One might argue Donald Trump falls into that category, and that's not a good example of someone who's good with people, to take an extreme example. Another thing I think plays very strongly into this is being very mindful of a neurodiverse approach, a neurodiverse friendly approach to empathy. And what I mean by that is, I think of our thousands of learners, only 2 or 3% self identify as being neurodiverse. And yet we design all of our learning experiences to be hypersensitive to people with neurodiverse needs for everybody. An example of that would be being explicit about instructions. So, not expecting people to be very empathetic and to automatically understand what's expected, but to break things down into micro instructions, micro learning, flashcards, revision cards, prompt cards, so people can go back over things. And actually, almost taking the assumption of empathy out of the equation, what you're doing is you're making reasonable adjustments, sometimes for a minority, but it's super helpful for everybody. So actually, if you know that you are going to have to present, knowing this is what the room, or this is what the Zoom link or the Google link or the Teams link, this is what's going to look like. If you have a problem, this is how to deal with it. These are the people that you're going to have to present to. These are their CVs. This is what the agenda is. These are the kinds of questions that they're going to ask you. Again, just like if you and I are preparing for a podcast, we're comfortable riffing with this, but we had a conversation and a bit of an exchange, a while back about these are some of the things we might explore and cover. So all of a sudden, some of those things that could build anxiety, you've helped take out of the equation. Now, I would say that's a great example of you showing empathy towards me as a guest on your program. And I think if we can apply that forethought around empathy and consideration for other people, let's break it down and let's think about people that don't necessarily instinctively get some of those interactions.
Yeah, and some of those things absolutely can be learned. One of the first things to learn there is not everybody's me.
Absolutely. I'll tell you another really good example of that is we talk about diversity a lot, but one of the things that's very rarely described in terms of a diverse mix, it's introverts and extroverts. I can veer between the two of them, but an extrovert, someone said to me recently, speaks to think. An introvert thinks to speak. And I love that because it's two absolutely polar opposite ways of thinking about the world, the workplace, the environment that you inhabit. And if you know that the way that they need interactions to be designed, to be optimized, is completely different. And just understanding that and then constructing how we have meetings, how we brainstorm things. Some people will need to talk it through and they'll find that a really creative extrovert process for their thinking. I'm one of those. But then there's another side of me as well, where actually I just need to go away and think about that. And I need to digest and process that. And then the quality of what I will come back with is completely different.
I want to talk for a second about B Corps. And this is going to come back. This sounds like a break in the conversation, but it's going to come back to this topic of humanities in business. You've started looking into becoming a B Corp. What's a B Corp and why?
A B Corp, it's a certain certification. It started in the US. It literally means benefits corporation. And it is describing businesses who've made a commitment to be a responsible business and a force for good in society. And what you actually have to do, it's not just a badge. To get the badge, you have to go through a certification process where you enshrine profit and purpose on an equal footing in everything that you do. So right from your articles of association, your shareholders agreements, but you are looking at what kind of impacts are we having at societal level, at an organizational level with all of our stakeholders, partners, clients, etc., suppliers, but then also with your individuals. And I feel that it was something that as a business, we have instinctively tried to be commercially successful. And I think the profit motive and a certain competence, or the highest level competence that you can apply to doing what you do and executing what you do, I think is really, really important. I think you can't grow without that. And if you can't grow, you can't have an impact. You can't create opportunities for your colleagues, your staff, your ecosystem. So the profit motive, I'm absolutely pro and not at all apologetic about. But it's what's the journey like in the pursuit of that profit? And actually, if it's purposeful and you are having positive impacts at a societal and an organizational and with your colleagues, then that feels like the way business needs to be conducted. And actually, I was thinking about this recently. If I was a politician, in Britain, we've had many, many prime ministers in the last few minutes, it seems. And if someone stood up and said, look, coming through the pandemic, looking at the level of disruption in the world, there are three things, no matter what nation you're in, what part of the world, that are unquestionably things that we need to be absolutely focused on the whole time. I would say they are planet, the sustainability, caring about nature. I would say they're about health and healthcare systems and resilience. You know, no one's going to be forgiven if there's a different pandemic or a different strain and we don't have PPE or there aren't beds or there isn't intensive care. But equally, at a local level, we need to make sure that people can have access to healthcare when they need it. But the third, I think, universal need is universal skills training. It's that part of education which isn't the traditional education system, but it's the ability to make sure that we can all reap the rewards of the changes coming down the line with the fourth industrial revolution, with AI machine learning. There are going to be many dividends, I believe, from these changes. But I think the common good is not about just creating opportunity for as many people as possible. It's partly that. But I think the common good is also caring about people that are on the periphery, people that could fall between the cracks, people that don't necessarily have access to the opportunities or the social capital or the jobs that everybody else that they see has. So I think as an organization, as a B corporation, you are navigating through the commercial realities that every other business does, but you are also looking at these interconnected challenges and how we go about those. And I think the great thing for me personally about a B Corp is if you look around, all of a sudden I'm seeing other organizations that I'm starting to recognize are B Corps, and they're in all sectors. There are banks, there are travel companies, and there is a certain kindredness. Again, we come back to that word where I recognize, okay, they care about similar things. They care about a solidarity that together we can achieve a lot more than we can individually. which is great. So I'm interested to explore common ground with other like-minded companies. But they also have a sense of intergenerational responsibility, in my experience. And that is not just transacting for now, which businesses generally do. So we're a learning business. We're in the business of upskilling adults, but we're also hugely committed to doing everything we possibly can for young people. And that doesn't mean we've got to do all the heavy lifting. If we can connect the employers we work with, we work with hundreds of big companies. If we can help connect them up to some of the things that we found that are amazing, that they could promote to their employees, then all of a sudden there might be millions of employees that are able to very simply intervene or do something practical for young people. But some of these other things we've talked about, actually, we've got to do these together because you can't save the planet on your own. And you don't want to save the planet just for yourself either. So there's a certain common sense connectedness to deal with some of these challenges.
I'd like to know if you have found the educational resources to become a B Corp. One of my favorite thinkers, who I manage to bring up in almost every podcast, is James C. Scott, who wrote a book called Seeing Like a State. And one of the things that comes out of that is that the tops-down technocratic way of looking at things, oftentimes what we try to do is we try to optimize a system for a single outcome. And when you do that, it comes at the cost of the other possible value that could come out of that system. So there's a trade-off there. But then the second thing is that frequently you don't even get the main outcome you're trying for, which is that if you decide to optimize a country, for instance, for GDP, it will come at the cost of other things, valuable things that might come out of that system. But the second thing is it might come at the cost of GDP. At least in the United States, business schools went through a phase where it was shareholder value, period. But as we start to look at B Corps, it's multiple things. This is why I knew I was going to bring it back to the humanities. When you're looking at these different stakeholders, these different beneficiaries of a business, and one of them is the workforce. Well, the workforce wants something quite complex, and the workforce wants something that's quite human. So now what we have is the need for empathy and humanity and humanities toward one of the key players that is touching a B Corp. So are you finding the learning resources for that?
I am. So if I were pointing yourself or any listeners to this podcast to resources that I've found helpful, Larry Fink, chairman and CEO of BlackRock, responsible for investing trillions of dollars, writes an annual letter to CEOs that they invest in. But if you look at the January 22 Larry Fink, just Google Larry Fink letter to CEOs. It's an absolutely brilliant exposition of looking at employees as key shareholders and stakeholders. And if we're talking about the design of human workplaces, well, workplaces are pretty much all populated virtually or physically by employees. And what it says is if you are not looking at the sustainability of your employees in the same way that you should be looking at the sustainability of the planet, you're not investable in. And that's a big call because companies will pay attention to that. If the board recognizes that, hang on, we are moving into amber and red territory in terms of investor profile, then that's pretty dangerous. And if one of the indicators of that is that we are not caring for the well-being of our employees, or indeed we're not developing our employees, one of the key things in terms of the new employee value proposition, wherever you are in the world and whatever size of company, is employees are saying, look, I'm not disloyal, but I'm not an indentured slave either. And I will work with you for a period of time. The deal is I'll work with you for this period of time on whatever the form of contract is. But at the end of that, I want to be more employable and more capable and have more options than I do now. And employers, from their perspective, need to recognize, because there's a big discussion if you like, kind of mini philosophical argument. Well, what's the kind of argument that I should invest in people so I make them more able to leave? But actually, Richard Branson says, well, why would you want people to stay if you're not going to invest in them? And I think that's very powerful. Mark Carney, he's a Canadian, was the governor of Bank of England for a number of years, has written a brilliant book called Values. It's quite a recent book. Mark Carney is a genuine Renaissance man, utterly brilliant book. So it dissects values across societies, but also this whole thing that we've been talking about in terms of what are the key focus areas. And me saying it's the planet, it's healthcare, it's education and skills. I've been saying that for a really long time. He says it in a very similar way. But actually, in terms of what responsible businesses look like and what responsible leadership looks like and what responsible workplaces look like, that's one of the clearest expositions I've come across.
Fantastic. That's great. It just sparked a memory for me. A friend of mine is a management consultant in Colombia, the country. He was hired by a CEO of one of the largest banks to read all of Shakespeare together. Every bit. And this particular friend, George Angel, is one of the most brilliant writers on the planet. I mean, seriously, he's great. But he's also a management consultant. And so to think that that's the kind of education that would position a leader and that they would pay a consultant full-time, a lot anyway, to come do that, it was sparked for me.
What that says to me, if I can just respond to that, Doc, what that says to me, whether it's Shakespeare or actually for that matter, any literature in any language from any culture, fundamentally, most literature, most stories are about relationships. And actually, you've got the greatest minds, and we were talking about empathy earlier, people that can imagine themselves inhabiting a whole population of characters and being able to imagine the interactions and the dynamics and how that works and the comedy and the tragedy and the light and the shade and the dark. And actually, I think art, literature, Shakespeare, whatever, it holds a mirror up to life. And actually, if we are really interested and understand the power of relationships and navigating those, or indeed some of the other kind of human dilemmas, if you've got people that have thought about those really deeply as the main pursuit in their lives, then what a treasure trove. Why wouldn't we want to explore those?
We're getting close to the end of the interview, so I want to ask the question I always ask, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Can I unpick that? What exactly does that mean, Dart?
Your job hires you to do something. Your work hires you to do something. It requires a certain set of things from you that you will essentially pay to it. But in exchange for that, you want something from work. What is that thing? And I'll go a little farther. There's some things at work that might eat your soul, And there's some things at work that make you feel whole and alive. What are those things?
One of the things for me, and it goes back to when I was a student and directing plays, it was I have a sense of a story and a narrative arc, but I quite like not knowing the in-between bits or how it's all going to work. And the magic for me is the interactions with other people where you can co-create something that's greater than anything I could possibly achieve on my own. And that sense of collective creative endeavor, and it doesn't have to be a noble cause or something massive. It can be just a conversation that you have with somebody in an interaction. And, as I was saying, as an extrovert, I speak to think. So if I'm surrounded by people and that's a really productive process, that's very, very stimulating for me. So that as a personal level, it's is another form of learning, but it's learning in the interactions with other people. At a broader, if you like, if that's micro and personal, at a macro level, I want to have as much of an impact as possible. I want to be a force for good. I want to use the work that I do or that we do collectively as a platform to leave the world, society, interactions we have in a better place than we found them. And I often say this to my colleagues or anybody else that will listen. You don't get this time back. The journey is really important. And yet we're trying to do things, but actually sometimes getting to the target is more disappointing than you thought it might be. The goal per se, it keeps moving if it's a good goal. But actually, if that's the case, you have to enjoy the pursuit of whatever you're doing. And for me, the pursuit of doing well, doing things competently as a learning business, adding value and helping people. I mean, the best feedback we get, and we get it consistently from our learners, is people say, I realized this was going to help me with my kind of relationships and my interactions at work. I had no idea it was going to have such a profound impact in my personal life with my friends, with my kids, with my partner, with all of these sort of cycles I've been in. And all of a sudden, I can see things differently. So it feels that that kind of having an impact beyond yourself, that's what I'm looking for in life. And that's what my work gives me.
That's beautiful. I think this idea of collaborative emergence, this idea of seeing a product of multiple minds and multiple diverse talents and seeing that come about and creating the space in which that can happen. It's a very, very powerful idea. And it's when I interview people, and sometimes they say, I like to work with teams. That's one of the things I go to work for. And you dig deeper and they say, well, I like to amplify myself. In other words, I don't think I can get as much done alone as I can with a team of like-minded people. But you're saying something slightly different, which is I like working with a team of not like-minded people to create something emergent that I could not possibly have predicted.
Absolutely. And if I was going to recommend a brilliant book on this, which is so much fun and so accessible a read, it's by a chap called Matthew Syed, Syed, and it's called Rebel Ideas. And each chapter takes a different angle on cognitive diversity. So chapter 1 is about 9/11 and says, look, the CIA was populated by Ivy League white middle class men, and they couldn't recognize that a guy sat in a cave on the other side of the world was a threat to the greatest military superpower that had ever been amassed. And they didn't realize that actually this Osama bin Laden chap in a cave in Afghanistan was basically preaching in symbolic terms and was running through a certain way that a whole world ecosystem understood. And so as a result, the CIA is now populated by every color and creed, every language, every religion, because you've got to cover your blind spots. And it has another chapter on, an Everest ascent that goes wrong because there's a powerful leader and nobody dares challenge the powerful leader, even in the face of the obvious calamity. And each chapter just takes another angle on you've got to have different views on any given challenge. And you've got to basically allow an environment for dissent, for disagreement, for that kind of honest feedback and smaller voices coming through. And I think that is the secret of not just a rich, inclusive workplace, but also is the secret sauce for us to solve the problems that we're going to face pretty much every working day.
2 more questions. What does work cost you?
That's a really good question. What does work cost me? There are many things that I would like to do in life, and I only have one life. So to give an example, I would like to direct and produce plays again. There's a couple of books I'd like to read. I love gardening. I would love to build a big garden. I just bought a plot of land on the west coast of Wales and we're building a house. So I might get the chance to do that. So there are all of these other things that I would like to do in life, but actually they involve quite a significant amount of time and commitment. So if I'm not going to be doing those, there's a certain opportunity cost to doing my work. So the work I'm doing has to feel valuable, that I'm prepared to allow the opportunity costs. And I guess I'm in a fortunate stage of life, Dart, where I could probably afford to do those other things instead of work, but I choose to work because it feels like purposeful, important work, and I enjoy it for the reasons I've described.
Yeah, I like that. The cost is all the other kinds of work you could do.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about you, about Future Talent?
FutureTalentLearning.com. So we've got stuff on the website. We publish quite a lot of thinking and thought leadership and white papers. Throughout 23, we're going to be posting those on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect to any other kindred spirits on LinkedIn. That's a kind of nice place to meet. I've had the joy of knowing you for a few years, Dart, and I think part of the joy of that is we've met and been introduced to various people in one another's ecosystems. So if there are any people that find their way to this podcast and would like to connect or would like to chat or explore some of the things we've talked about, then that would be my pleasure.
Fantastic. It's interesting. We knew each other beforehand, but you're one of my pandemic friends.
That's right.
And the thing about pandemic friends...
It's like saying you're one of my plague friends.
I know. But what's interesting is that pandemic friends are more international. My pandemic friends are incredibly global and all over the place because we were all locked in the house. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show.
No, I've thoroughly enjoyed, as ever, Dart, our conversation. So thank you very much for making the time for this session.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.